welcome to the deep dive. You've given us a stack of sources today that, well, they demand immediate attention.
They really do.
We're talking about a massive, high-stakes political comparison. It spans two of the most geopolitically significant nations on the planet, Iran and Pakistan.
And these sources, which are a collection of really powerful essays, they're not just observing, they're performing a comparative political analysis.
Right, and arguing that both of these nations stand at a truly critical inflection point.
That's absolutely right. And I think our mission today is to, really dive deep into the specific architecture of what the sources are calling Islamist authoritarianism.
The architecture, I like that word. It suggests something that's been built deliberately.
Exactly. It's not an accident. And we're going to be examining their urgent, almost frantic call for a democratic transition in both countries. And this is the key part, synthesizing the surprisingly strong structural parallels they present.
And they are surprising, because on the surface, they look so different.
Completely different. You have clerical robes defining Tehran and, military uniforms defining Islamabad. But the argument here is that if you look under the hood, the engine is remarkably similar.
The moment of urgency is really the defining characteristic here. The sources, they immediately lay down this core thesis. History has presented a narrow, unmistakable window of opportunity.
They call it a moment when the iron is hot.
The iron is hot. And they insist with just this remarkable conviction that inaction by external powers or, and this is critical, by the domestic populations themselves, well, it would constitute complicity.
That's a heavy charge.
It is. So we have to unpack this. I mean, what does striking the hot iron practically mean across two nations with such different relationships to both religion and military power?
It's a compelling analytical framework, really, because it refuses to treat Iran and Pakistan as separate problems solved by separate mechanisms.
Yeah.
It binds their fates together under one umbrella. It's the necessity of democratic renewal in the face of this structural ideological authoritarianism. This analysis posits that the foundational weakness is the same, even if the outward manifestation, in the robes and the uniforms, is distinct.
Okay, so where do we start?
We need to start where the decay appears most advanced, which, according to these sources, is Iran. The premise is crystal clear. The time for hesitation is over, and the opportunity is now.
All right, let's start with the diagnosis of the Islamic Republic. The sources calculate that after nearly 50 years of clerical rule, the system isn't just failing, it's utterly exhausted.
And they use three specific words: politically, economically, morally.
That's a total collapse of legitimacy. It suggests a systemic failure far, far beyond simple mismanagement or, a bad economic cycle.
That exhaustion narrative is really the bedrock of their argument for immediate action. They're emphasizing that the regime isn't just suffering from, say, cyclical unpopularity.
Right, which all governments face.
Exactly. This is different. It has reached a point of existential hollowing out. They describe the mood on the ground as having completely shifted.
How so?
Well, the initial revolutionary fervor, the utopian idealism that powered the system's early years, has entirely evaporated. It's gone.
And what's replaced it?
It's been replaced by a pervasive sense of quiet rage, suppressed hope, and an unambiguous demand: this regime must end.
That's incredibly stark. This isn't protest for reform. It's an existential rejection of the state's fundamental identity.
Precisely. It's not "we want cheaper bread." It's "we want a different country."
That distinction from loud revolutionary fervor to quiet rage is profoundly important. It suggests a deep societal weariness. It implies that the average Iranian citizen is simply tired.
Tired of the system's demands, its failures, its corruption. And the economic data mentioned elsewhere in these sources, particularly the catastrophic currency collapse and the chronic, deeply embedded corruption, it all reinforces this diagnosis of structural decay.
So the conclusion from the sources is absolutely unambiguous.
The Ayatollah must go.
And that clarity of demand is matched by a crucial clarification regarding the nature of the uprising itself. The sources are highly, highly sensitive to the historical baggage of Western interference.
Oh, massively so. They insist this is not a call for an American-made revolution.
Why is it so essential for them to stress this point? It seems designed to preempt the immediate criticism that this proposed roadmap is just neo-colonial meddling.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
They state forcefully that the Iranian movement is organic, internal, and deeply rooted.
Meaning the people themselves have been driving this.
For decades. They've been paying the ultimate price for demanding freedom for decades. They've done the heavy lifting, they've organized the movements, and they've endured the massacres.
So the core argument is that external powers need to recognize that the revolutionary impetus is already there. It's internal.
Yes, the task for the West isn't to start a revolution, but to ensure the existing homegrown one isn't immediately crushed by overwhelming state violence.
So if they don't want an invasion or, some kind of micromanagement from Washington, what is the specific ask? The sources define this need with that single powerful word, space. But let's elaborate on what that means in practical geopolitical terms.
Space is it's a very nuanced concept here. It means creating the conditions where the Iranian populace can organize without being immediately disappeared.
Or worse.
Or worse, where they can voice dissent without being massacred, and ultimately where they can finish the job history has placed before them.
And Washington's role in creating this space.
Specifically, it's not to execute regime change. It's to create a protective diplomatic and strategic shield. The goal is to alter the regime's internal risk assessment.
It's calculation about what it can get away with.
Precisely. What is the cost of using maximum force against its own citizens? Right now, the cost is low. The goal is to make it unacceptably high.
This is where the proposal becomes, well, politically audacious. The sources detail a specific non-military role for Washington leadership, and they explicitly cite the necessity of a decisive, clear-minded figure.
And they go there. They proposed the specific function of former President Donald Trump to establish what they call the doctrine of deterrence.
Okay, this is arguably the most controversial and high-risk element of the entire roadmap.
No question.
The sources argue that Trump doesn't need to micromanage or occupy Iran's future. His essential task is just making it unmistakably clear that brutal retaliation by the regime will not be tolerated.
This moves the conversation from, vague human rights condemnations and toothless sanctions to actually influencing the regime's core calculus of survival. But I have to challenge this. I have to. Given the disastrous historical precedent of externally driven regime change in the region, Iraq, Libya, the list goes on, how do the sources argue that this proposed doctrine of deterrence is functionally different?
That's the key question. How does it avoid the exact chaos they claim they want to prevent? The moment the U.S. gets involved, doesn't the Iranian regime instantly and frankly, credibly claim the uprising is just an American plot?
That is the precise risk the sources acknowledge, and they attempt to mitigate it through the specificity of the deterrence doctrine.
Yeah.
They draw a very sharp line between the full-scale military invasion,
building,
all of that, a very sharp line between that and targeted preemptive pressure. The argument is that the intervention, if it even comes to that, must be surgical and defensive.
Defensive of whom?
Of the populace, aimed solely at protecting the populace from a state-sponsored massacre, not at nation-building or installing some kind of puppet government.
Okay, so let's analyze the proposed mechanism. How does a credible threat, even if it's not initially military, actually change the Ayatollah's entire calculus in Tehran?
The sources outline a two-pronged effect. It's psychological and it's strategic. First, the credible threat of intervention, followed by real intervention if necessary.
And what's the trigger for if necessary?
A Tiananmen Square-style massacre. That's the red line. If that happens, the threat becomes real. And that threat is designed to fracture elite unity within the regime.
Specifically within the security apparatus, the IRGC.
Yes, the Revolutionary Guard Corps.
And what specifically fractures them? Is it fear for their lives or something else?
It's fear for their assets and their ability to operate. It's self-preservation. If the IRGC leadership suspects that slaughtering unarmed civilians will come at a high, unacceptable price.
And not just abstract sanctions that they can get around.
Exactly. Not that. But targeted strikes on their command structure, their oil revenue infrastructure, or their known corporate assets. Suddenly their willingness to follow the Ayatollah's order to kill, well, it erodes dramatically.
Because they have a lot to lose.
Immense financial stakes. The sources note that the IRGC leadership is deeply invested in the regime's economy. So targeting those stakes through a credible strategic threat changes their loyalty calculation from, pure ideological adherence to pragmatic self-preservation.
And the second function of this doctrine?
The second function is to embolden the streets. When the instruments of repression are paralyzed by uncertainty, even for a moment, that pause gives the streets the space they need to organize and sustain their momentum.
So it's a feedback loop.
It is. The sources argue that deterrence works only when it is believed. If the regime believes the consequences of a mass killing are too high, they hesitate. And that hesitation is the critical window for the revolution to gain irreversible momentum. It's an act of highly calibrated pressure.
Designed to be proportionate only to the violence deployed against civilians.
That's the key. It's not a blank check for war.
So what the sources are, in essence, asking for is a strategic guarantee against genocide, leveraging American power to serve an organic Iranian movement. It's a high-wire act.
It absolutely is. And the sources stress that the greatest moral failure would be to stand by and watch the revolution fail due to predictable state brutality, when a clear red line could have prevented it.
Which brings us directly to the next inevitable question. Assuming this all works, assuming this deterrence is successful and the regime collapses, how do they propose avoiding the dreaded power vacuum? Another Iraq or Libya scenario that everyone fears.
Chaos is the great fear, right? It paralyzes many in Tehran and internationally. So the source material proposes a specific, and they stress, non-radical transitional roadmap to prevent total systemic collapse.
Okay, what does that look like?
They argue that the nation needs a temporary stabilizing structure, a bridge from the old collapsed clerical order to a functional democratic future.
And their solution?
Their solution is historical, constitutional, and, frankly, surprising. It's the temporary installation of Reza Pahlavi as a constitutional monarch.
Let's pause on the sheer political audacity of that proposal. I mean, asking the Iranian people who suffered under the previous Pahlavi dynasty to accept a Pahlavi even temporarily sounds incredibly risky.
It does.
What is the historical or cultural justification the sources use to frame him as a neutral symbol rather than a symbol of the old, despised order?
The sources are very careful here. They separate the current proposal from the autocratic history of the Shah. They clarify that the previous Pahlavi dynasty's greatest failure was autocracy and a relationship with the West that many Iranians saw as, well, exploitative.
So how is this different?
The current Reza Pahlavi's mandated role is strictly limited and defined by consent. He would serve as a neutral symbol of continuity. He's not a ruler, not a prime minister, not a decision maker.
So he's a placeholder, a figurehead.
A national figurehead, exactly. To ensure that the concept of the Iranian state, which is distinct from the Islamic Republic, does not just vanish overnight.
He provides a recognizable legal and institutional framework, a flag, a symbol of transition, to prevent the descent into factional warfare and immediate systemic collapse.
Precisely. And crucially, the sources emphasize that his power is time-bound and non-renewable by his own will. He can't decide to stick around.
And what is the single mandatory goal of this interim government anchored by Pahlavi?
It is explicitly time-bound and has one goal: organizing open, free, and fair elections for a constituent assembly within 1 year. That's it.
And that assembly is the core democratic event.
It is. The sources view Pahlavi as a constitutional anchor whose sole function is to facilitate the transfer of sovereignty from the collapsing regime to the people's chosen representatives.
But why can't the existing institutions, the parliament or the judiciary, handle this transition? Why is a brand new constituent assembly necessary?
Because a parliament operates under an existing law, often a captured or compromised one. A constituent assembly, however, is the sovereign body that writes the new foundational law. It transfers sovereignty from the coercive power of the state directly to the people.
It's a one-time existential political event.
Yes, that asks the deepest questions of nationhood.
So the monarch is the temporary mechanism, and the constituent assembly is the permanent political solution. That body lets the people choose their final system, free from immediate coercion.
Exactly. The assembly will determine what legitimacy looks like. Will they choose a republic, a constitutional monarchy, some kind of hybrid system? The sources insist the power is transferred not to Pahlavi permanently, but through him directly to the electorate.
And this structure, they argue, removes the most dangerous element of collapse,
which is the immediate existential fighting over the nature and identity of the state itself.
Now let's consider the massive global implications cited by the sources. They argue that this isn't just an Iranian issue, it's a profound moment of regional and global clarity.
Oh, the regional implications of Tehran's fall are, they're dramatic. The sources suggest it would trigger a collective sigh of relief across the Middle East.
What are some of the predicted outcomes?
Well, consider this. Hezbollah, Hamas, and other militant proxies across the region would lose their primary financial, strategic, and political patron. The sources say they would wither.
The nuclear brinkmanship would evaporate.
Largely evaporate, yes. And sectarian conflict, which is so often amplified and funded by Tehran, would slow dramatically.
So you're saying the sources argue the outcome is not increased regional chaos, but instead an overwhelming sense of clarity. That seems completely counterintuitive to the prevailing narrative of chaos following regime collapse.
It does. But it's because the sources define the Islamic Republic not as a stabilizing factor, but as the single greatest engine of regional instability.
So removing that engine.
Removing the state that actively funds and directs multiple non-state actors in Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and elsewhere means the region could finally breathe without the constant specter of ideological extremism radiating outward from Tehran. They see this as a necessary, painful, but ultimately stabilizing step for the entire region.
The sources make a strong case that history favors the brave and punishes the hesitant in this precise moment. It's a powerful, time-sensitive plan for external action to facilitate an internal, organic process.
And that brings us to the conceptual link. The sources insist that if the wall cracks in Tehran, the tremor will be felt deeply, deeply in Pakistan.
The critical intellectual pivot.
Exactly. The sources transition from a prescriptive roadmap for Iran to a descriptive analysis of Pakistan, arguing that the structural failure of unaccountable, ideologically cloaked authoritarianism is not confined to one nation. It's a regional phenomenon.
So we introduce the comparison to Pakistan. The structures appear different, a military state versus a clerical state, but the sources argue the disease is familiar and in many ways deeper. What is the nature of this disease in the Pakistani context?
The disease is the persistent subversion of genuine popular sovereignty by unaccountable power. In Pakistan, the sources state that the governance reality is ruled by the barracks, not the ballot.
Coercion over consent.
It is governance defined by coercion wrapped in ideology. This suggests that the military component, the barracks, and the religious component, Islamism, function in what the sources call an unholy alliance.
And this alliance is what hollows out the democratic institutions.
Systematically.
Yeah.
It prevents genuine civilian supremacy and it brutally silences dissent.
Okay, but why do the sources suggest the disease is in some ways deeper in Pakistan? I mean, they have regularly held elections, they have a parliament, a prime minister. It looks more like a democracy.
And that's exactly why it's deeper. Because the facade of democracy is so meticulously maintained in Pakistan. The public is accustomed to the performance of voting, but they know deep down that the core functions of civilian rule,
like control over foreign policy, the defense budget,
the economy, intelligence services, all of it is continually subverted by the military establishment. The illusion makes the corruption harder to fight because it claims democratic legitimacy. It's a systemic betrayal of the ballot box.
But unlike Iran, where external deterrence is proposed to prevent a bloodbath, the sources insist Pakistan's future must not be externally engineered. Why the different methodology?
This is a crucial analytical distinction, and it's based on their unique national histories. The sources emphasize that Pakistan, unlike post-revolutionary Iran, has had decades of what you could call democratic rehearsal.
The motions of...
Exactly. It has institutions, a constitutional history, a strong tradition of civic mobilization, even if those elements are currently captured or suppressed. So the argument is that no foreign capital can manufacture a legitimacy for Pakistan, that its people haven't earned themselves.
So external pressure might support, but it cannot substitute for internal resolve.
Precisely. The sources argue that change must arise from mass political awakening, sustained civic pressure, and the reclaiming of stolen democratic space. This places the onus entirely on the 230 million Pakistani citizens to exercise their democratic muscle. It is a definitive call for courage.
And how specifically do the sources suggest this awakening should manifest? Should it be, chaotic and confrontational?
No, they're highly prescriptive about the methodology. The people must rise with numbers, not guns, and with clarity, not vengeance.
Nonviolence is central.
Absolutely. This emphasis on nonviolence and mass mobilization, turning the streets into a forum for disciplined, visible civic action, is central to the whole idea. They stress that authoritarian systems thrive on the perceived futility of resistance.
The idea that nothing will ever change.
Right. But when millions of people show up peacefully, that calculated obedience fractures, and the system is forced to reveal its true coercive nature to the world.
And this movement, this need for numbers, is currently crystallized around the figure of Imran Khan. The sources dedicate a substantial amount of analysis to his role.
Yes, they frame him as a symbol and a momentum point for this democratic awakening.
And the analysis of Khan is strategically framed. They concede he is not perfect, he's a political figure, flawed like any other.
But they argue that's secondary to his symbolic power right now. He represents the idea that civilian authorities should not kneel before generals.
That the nation's fate should be decided by voters, not by the military establishment?
Yes. So his current imprisonment, then, becomes the clearest possible litmus test for the legitimacy of the entire system.
How so?
The sources frame it with surgical precision. His imprisonment is not about law, it is about fear.
Fear of his popularity.
Fear of popular will. They argue that a truly confident system would defeat a popular leader through fair competition at the polls. By resorting to incarceration and an institutional manipulation, the system demonstrates its profound fear and its reliance on coercion.
So the demand for Khan's release is fundamentally a demand to restore a principle.
It is a demand to restore the principle of civilian supremacy, the idea that political disputes must be resolved through elections and parliamentary procedure, not through secret military courts and politically motivated arrests.
The sources are trying to move the conversation past Khan the man to the system that jailed him,
That's the crucial shift in focus.
which forces us to acknowledge the real power center in Pakistan. Every authoritarian system, the sources contend, has a face that pretends to rule and a structure that actually does.
Yes, and in Pakistan, the sources observe that prime ministerial titles have become, well, transient placeholders. The power has never truly transferred.
Everyone knows it.
Everyone. From the public to the foreign diplomats to the current office holders, everyone knows the real power lies elsewhere.
And when that real power, the military authority, fuses with the ideological rigidity of Islamism, the sources suggest it creates a unique and profound danger.
That fusion creates a system that claims ultimate divine righteousness and national security as its shield.
Which allows it to systematically deny accountability to the people.
Of course. When the power center claims to act on behalf of God and the nation, any challenge is automatically branded not just as political dissent, but as treason or blasphemy.
And this is the core reason the comparison to the clerical rule in Tehran is so compelling.
It is. The problem is not personalities alone. It is the fundamental architecture of unaccountable power cloaked in ideology.
Okay, this is where we execute the core intellectual move of this entire deep dive. The sources establish the central aha moment. Iran and Pakistan operate as parallel systems of control.
And you said it before, different outward manifestations, clerical robes versus military uniforms, but the fundamental substance of control is shared.
We have to linger on that shared substance. The source material argues that both systems rely on unelected authority figures who sit above the state, above parliament, and above accountability.
And in both nations, the democratic trappings, the elections, the courts, the parliaments, are reduced to a facade. This isn't just common political corruption. It is a structural mechanism designed to concentrate and perpetuate power beyond the reach of the populace.
Let's execute the side-by-side comparison of the ultimate power brokers. Let's start with Iran, which is the more obvious case.
In Iran, the architecture is explicit. It's written down. The supreme leader, the Ayatollah, decides all fundamental issues of state, ideology, and strategy.
Full stop. And then presidents.
They're transient administrators. They're selected from a very narrow pool of vetted loyalists. The elections serve to manage public opinion and provide a veneer of activity, but they never, ever alter the core reality of clerical power.
Okay, now the sources apply that powerful, very loaded term to the equivalent figure in Pakistan, the Pakistani Ayatollah.
This is a deliberate, provocative, rhetorical move. It's designed to shock you, the listener, into recognizing the functional equivalence.
And they identify this figure as who?
As General Munir, an unelected authority whose institutional power eclipses that of the civilian prime minister, the parliament, and the judiciary combined.
And the sources detail how this authority is cloaked in religious symbolism, mirroring Tehran's clerical approach. How does a general do that? How does Munir use religious symbolism in what is supposed to be a secular military context?
The sources point to his most publicly touted credential in Pakistan. And it's not military genius or some battlefield success. It's the highly specific claim that he memorized the Quran as a child, a hafiz.
And that detail is used, the sources suggest, to do what?
To graft an ideological and religious shield onto raw military power. By claiming this level of personal piety, he establishes a kind of ideological immunity.
So criticism of him or the military establishment can then be easily framed as
blasphemous or fundamentally anti-Islamic. It neutralizes legitimate political opposition just as effectively as the Ayatollah does in Iran.
So the mechanism of control is the same. Use faith to sanctify coercion. But there is one absolutely crucial geopolitical distinction the sources stress between these two supreme leaders.
Yes, and this difference elevates the stakes in Pakistan exponentially. The Iranian Ayatollah, despite all the regional fear he inspires, does not control a nuclear arsenal.
General Munir, the Pakistani Ayatollah, does.
He does. And this introduces a unique and profound geopolitical risk inherent in the Pakistani structure. It's the potential fragility and unaccountability of a system governing nuclear weapons.
It transforms the debate from an internal political crisis to a fundamental global security concern.
Absolutely. It demands legitimate, civilian, and transparent oversight over that arsenal.
Which they don't have.
The sources argue that in a state where the civilian leadership is demonstrably weak, and the real power is concentrated in the hands of one unelected authority figure, the stability of the nuclear command and control system is always vulnerable to internal political instability, or just a miscalculation driven by that very unaccountability.
Let's move to the elections, what the sources call the hollow electoral processes. Both states hold them, they claim mandates, yet the outcomes are carefully managed to preserve the core structure of control.
In Iran, as we said, elections are tightly managed exercises in controlled choice. The Guardian Council vets all the candidates to ensure only system loyalists are even eligible to run.
The boundaries of power are never in dispute.
Never. The election is merely a tool for selecting a transient administrator loyal to the Ayatollah. It is, at the end of the day, selection disguised as an election.
And the sources state that Pakistan's elections increasingly mirror this exact controlled model, eroding the last vestiges of genuine political competition.
They document how outcomes in Pakistan are shaped long before the ballots are even cast. This systemic manipulation involves the disqualification of key opponents, mass arrests of political workers, total control over the media narrative.
And immense institutional pressure on the judiciary and the election commission?
Right, so the result is structurally identical to Iran. You get a figurehead executive. The sources summarize the functional reality with this brutal line: the Iranian president is a nobody. The Pakistani prime minister is a nobody.
Executives without genuine supremacy.
Exactly.
Okay, let's deepen the dive into what might be the most destructive parallel: the economic model. The sources analyze the shared economic architecture of control, where the power systems actively monopolize national wealth.
This is the critical non-ideological pillar of their power. Authoritarianism requires not just the suppression of votes, but the systemic extraction of wealth to fund itself.
And in both Iran and Pakistan, the true centers of power, not the civilian ministries, monopolize massive portions of the national economy.
Can we get specific here? What are these mechanisms of control in each country so you, our listener, understand this isn't just generalized corruption?
Please.
We're talking about systemic extraction. In Iran, the sources detail the power of the bonyads.
What are those?
They're powerful religious trusts or foundations. They operate tax-free, often completely outside the normal governmental budget process, and they control vast swaths of industrial and financial assets. They capture entire sectors of the economy and ensure the economic interests of the clerical elite are perpetually secure, insulated from market forces or any public accountability.
And in Pakistan, what's the parallel?
The sources point directly to the military welfare foundations and corporate enterprises. These are huge, diversified conglomerates that operate across banking, construction, real estate, manufacturing, even farming.
And they get preferential treatment.
Massively. Subsidized land, tax breaks, favorable contracts. It ensures all national economic risk falls upon the populace, while all predictable profit accrues to the unelected elite. They function as a state within a state, distorting competition and preventing the growth of a genuinely free civilian economy.
So the predictable outcome of this parallel setup is structural poverty for the many and hyper-privilege for the very few.
Absolutely. It creates a structural distortion where resources are extracted upward to benefit the elite, while risk, stagnation, inflation, and scarcity are pushed downward onto the general population.
There's a quote that captures this.
Inflation for the people, privilege for the elite. It's that simple.
And how do these systems rationalize this massive structural failure? How do they sell it?
The sources explain that the resulting economic damage, the stagnation, the corruption, the isolation, is rationalized by the elite as a necessary cost of patriotism.
Of defending the nation from external enemies.
Always. And critically, dissent against the resulting manufactured poverty is immediately branded as treason, anti-state activity, or blasphemy. The ruling class continues to expand its balance sheets while demanding indefinite sacrifices from the masses in the name of God and country.
Which returns us to that ideological fusion. Islamism as a political technology, making criticism into sacrilege.
The sources define this fusion of coercion and theology as a masterstroke of control. In Iran, opposition is framed as heresy, funded by foreign enemies seeking to destroy the faith. In Pakistan, dissent is painted as anti-Islamic, anti-army, or anti-state.
By merging the authority of the military with religious identity, accountability is neutralized.
It's impossible. A politician can be wrong. A general or an Ayatollah operating under this dual shield is fundamentally incapable of error. Any failure is just proof of a foreign conspiracy.
Finally, let's look at how this shared architecture translates into their respective foreign policies. The sources talk about the structural externalization of conflict.
Yes, they draw a direct structural comparison here. Iran's role as an ideological antagonist and a permanent source of pressure vis-à-vis Israel is compared to Pakistan's perpetual strategic confrontation vis-à-vis India.
The function of this external confrontation is identical.
Identical. Both regimes use perpetual conflict to externalize internal failure.
To justify the concentration of power and distract the populace from their domestic woes.
Precisely. Maintaining a state of conflict and an omnipresent external enemy justifies high military spending, massive security budgets, and the continuation of these unaccountable power structures. For both regimes, the sources conclude, peace becomes inherently dangerous.
Dangerous to the regime's identity and justification for existence, not to the safety of the people.
Exactly. They need the threat to keep the mechanism of control running.
So whether they wear clerical robes or military uniforms, the architecture is the same. Unelected supreme authority, managed elections, figurehead executives, concentrated economic power, and ideology used as a shield.
And the common goal is to sustain the illusion of legitimacy while populations are exhausted and impoverished.
And the crucial lesson for Pakistan, drawn from the sources' analysis of Iran, is the recognition of where the power actually lies.
Who profits from the stagnation and who pays the price? Once that illusion of legitimacy becomes impossible to sustain among the masses, the architecture begins to crack, regardless of how strong the facade appears.
All right, let's now focus entirely on the path forward for Pakistan, transitioning from diagnosis to prescription. The sources start with a really powerful argument against political and economic determinism. They insist that Pakistan's pervasive poverty is not fate.
This point is so incredibly important because it pushes back against fatalism. This idea that Pakistan is just doomed to be mismanaged, that it's just the way things are.
The sources dismantle this belief.
They do, by arguing that Pakistan's economic stagnation is the direct, cumulative result of decades of military dominance over civilian life. This dominance has ensured that national budgets are continually skewed toward control rather than development.
And that elections are managed rather than respected.
Exactly. So poverty is policy, not an accident.
The powerful conclusion is that nations are not poor by accident. They are made poor by systems.
And that systemic failure, rooted in this military ideological alliance, is the core obstacle to renewal. To fix the economy, you must first fix the political structure. There's no other way.
Okay, so if the existing institutions, the parliament, the judiciary, the election commission, are largely captured by this alliance, where does peaceful change actually start?
The sources point clearly to the streets as the last remaining forum of accountability.
They argue for reclaiming sovereignty through sustained, nonviolent civic space.
This mobilization is defined by three elements: visibility, numbers, and refusing to be invisible anymore. It cannot be chaotic or factional. It has to be a disciplined, persistent, and moral pressure campaign.
A campaign that forces the coercive structure to choose between mass violence and concession.
Yes, you make the cost of repression too high, morally and politically.
So this shift from institutional lobbying to mass mobilization is how a society reclaims sovereignty that has been stolen by unaccountable power structures.
Yes. The sources frame this as the reclamation of the state by its rightful owners, the citizens. It's not a rebellion against the state itself. The strategy relies on making the current system's illegitimacy undeniable, even to its own agents.
And central to this reclamation process is the role of Imran Khan, again framed not as a permanent political savior, but as a necessary transitional bridge.
His role is defined as a transitional necessity, and that means his current political utility is tied entirely to this moment of systemic crisis. His continued imprisonment is the single most potent symbol of collapsed electoral legitimacy.
Therefore, his release, achieved through constitutional means, signals the decisive reopening of political space that the populace is demanding.
That's the first step. The door creaks open.
But why is Khan essential? Couldn't any popular leader fill this vacuum? Why tie the entire transition to one specific political figure who also carries historical baggage and has plenty of political opponents.
The sources argue that Khan's utility is precisely because his imprisonment has become the singular focus of the mass awakening. He has unified a movement that's focused on the principle of civilian supremacy. He's the symbol, whether you like him or not.
So his release is the necessary precondition for acknowledging the popular will that the establishment currently fears so much.
It is. It's the symbolic victory that makes the next steps possible.
And what is the specific time-bound mandate proposed for Khan? This draws a direct parallel to Pahlavi's proposed role in Iran.
The proposal is very specific. Khan returns as interim prime minister with a singular, clear, and non-negotiable mandate.
Which is?
To organize genuine, free, and fair elections and facilitate the formation of a constituent assembly. Like Pahlavi, he acts as a temporary stabilizer and facilitator, not a permanent ruler. His mandate expires once the foundational legal work is complete.
Let's fully elaborate on the foundational importance of this constituent assembly. Why is it the ultimate goal? Why not just have a fair election and let the new parliament fix things?
Because the sources contend that Pakistan has only ever rehearsed democracy since its founding. It has never fully achieved civilian supremacy.
Constitutions have been repeatedly suspended, hollowed out, or rewritten by ruling elites.
Primarily the military establishment, so a new parliament would still be working within that broken framework. The Constituent Assembly is a mechanism designed to answer the core, unresolved, existential questions that haunt the nation, to build a new framework.
And what are those core questions that only a Constituent Assembly can answer?
First, and most importantly, who ultimately governs? The principle of civilian supremacy must be enshrined beyond any doubt. Second, what is the military's explicit, limited, and non-negotiable role in a civilian state?
This would require constitutional clarity on budget control, strategic policymaking, and economic oversight.
Things they have never had. And third, how is power permanently limited and accountability ensured against this ideological cloaking we've been talking about?
These deep questions cannot be answered by generals or judges under pressure or by foreign powers.
Only the people, through a truly representative body, can forge a constitutional settlement that's rooted in popular consent.
The sources also acknowledge that this is not just an internal fight. They place a significant moral and practical responsibility on the Pakistani diaspora, a million-strong, globally connected group.
The diaspora is seen as an essential external lever. Their role is framed as global advocacy against systemic repression. This involves amplifying the voices of civic movements back home.
It involves providing crucial financial support for organization and communication.
And, perhaps most importantly, pressuring host governments, whether in the U.S., the U.K., or the Gulf, to prioritize democratic norms over strategic convenience with the military establishment.
The warning is simple but stark. Silence abroad strengthens repression at home.
Absolutely. A system built on coercion relies on international indifference or outright complicity. Global advocacy by the diaspora provides a necessary corrective, making the repression visible and costly to the establishment and the international sphere.
The final segment of this roadmap focuses on the sheer urgency of the moment, arguing that history punishes indecision.
This is the source's final fervent plea against historical inertia. Authoritarian systems operate by exhausting the populace, by convincing them that resistance is futile and that reform will happen tomorrow after the next emergency.
But tomorrow never arrives.
It never arrives under these systems. The sources argue that the current moment is not a call for destruction, but a call for reconstruction rooted in consent and popular will. The urgency is rooted in the belief that Pakistan stands at a democratic threshold it has avoided for decades, and that courage is now its greatest national resource.
We have to dedicate significant time to dissecting this highly controversial analogy the sources draw. Imran Khan as Pakistan's Nelson Mandela, the comparison is explicit.
It is. But as you mentioned earlier, it is less about the men being identical and more about their imprisonment serving as a powerful symbolic mirror to the nation.
That analytical frame is everything, isn't it?
It is. The sources use the Mandela comparison not to equate the men's political history or their personal stature, but to analyze the function of unjust political incarceration.
So what is that function?
They argue that the imprisonment of Imran Khan has ceased to be about the individual. It has become a profound, undeniable revelation about the system that put him there. His jail cell, they argue, exposes the system's nature as one that cannot defeat him democratically.
And must therefore rely solely on coercion.
Exactly. In other words, the fight is no longer about one man's freedom, but the freedom of 230 million Pakistanis.
The system believes it is jailing a man, but the people see a system jailing an idea.
The idea of free choice, of civilian supremacy. The injustice becomes a universal metaphor for all the stolen elections, all the repressed voices, and the entire architecture of unaccountable power.
And the sources analyze the crucial political mistake that authoritarian systems always seem to make when they jail a popular, charismatic leader.
They believe incarceration ends the movement by silencing its head. But in reality, it simplifies the stakes for the populace.
How so?
Khan's detention is framed as a pure political statement. It's a declaration by the establishment that popular will is subordinate to unelected power. This act of personal injustice becomes the catalyst for collective awakening in a society that already recognizes the hollowness of its democratic rituals.
Let's delve deeper into the analogy to Mandela's 27 years in prison. How does the concept of moral endurance, tested by time, apply here?
The sources reference the historical lesson of moral endurance. The apartheid regime thought that time would erase Mandela, that he'd be forgotten.
But the opposite occurred.
The exact opposite. Time elevated him. By the time he walked free, the moral argument against apartheid had already been decisively won, globally. And it was won through nonviolence, sacrifice, and mass participation.
So Pakistan, by jailing its most popular civilian leader while claiming democratic legitimacy, invites the same critical global and internal question the world once asked of apartheid.
That's the core of the analogy. The act of imprisonment clarifies the moral argument for everyone. A state that claims to be a democracy that jails the man who represents the popular will, well, it reveals its own insecurity and its moral vacuum. The system inadvertently forces the issue. Who does this state truly serve?
The movement, then, is framed as a fight for several indivisible freedoms. Let's list and elaborate on the specific elemental freedoms being sought, reinforcing that one cannot exist without the others.
The sources identify 5 core freedoms that they argue must be achieved simultaneously for the transition to be successful.
The first 2 are political: freedom from militarist tyranny and freedom from Islamist tyranny.
Correct. The demand for freedom from militarist tyranny means establishing that national destiny, strategy, and economic life are decided in open civilian debate, not in closed rooms by generals.
And the demand for freedom from Islamist tyranny.
That's the specific requirement to liberate faith from its weaponization, to end the political technology that uses religion to silence dissent and suppress accountability.
And the next 2 elements deal with the economic consequences of misrule.
Yes. The sources demand freedom from engineered poverty, which they have established is the direct result of military and elite dominance and distorted budget priorities. This is coupled with the demand for freedom from want.
Which means establishing the necessary economic structures, free markets, fair competition,
to ensure opportunity in a nation rich in talent but chronically poor in opportunity due to these extractive economic models.
And finally, the psychological freedom, the freedom from fear.
Freedom from fear. This is perhaps the most fundamental requirement of all. It is the end of the state where speaking the truth risks disappearance, prosecution, or exile.
And the sources emphasize that these 5 freedoms are indivisible.
Completely. You cannot have economic opportunity without freedom from militarist control, and you cannot have political freedom if dissent is simultaneously labeled as sacrilege. They all have to be one together.
This comprehensive analysis frames the current situation not just as another political crisis, but as the democratic birth moment for Pakistan.
The sources argue that this is the final, inescapable logic of the situation. Pakistan has held elections, yes, but it has never fully transferred sovereignty from coercive power to the people.
So freeing Imran Khan is not the ultimate destination.
But it is the opening of the gate toward genuine, irreversible civilian supremacy. South Africa could not achieve its moral and political freedom until Mandela was free. The sources assert the same unavoidable logic now confronts the millions in Pakistan seeking true voice and sovereignty.
The concluding message is a powerful directive to overcome decades of learned helplessness and political paralysis.
It's a rejection of the system's main survival mechanism, exhausting the people until they believe resistance is futile. History, the sources insist, proves that wrong. The current moment is the time for visibility, for discipline, and for peaceful relentlessness.
Turning one high-profile, unjust imprisonment into a national collective awakening.
Exactly. And they argue that if the people of Iran, under a more overtly theocratic and harsh system, can rise to reclaim their dignity, the Pakistanis, who already possess the infrastructure of democracy, can and must do the same. The conviction is strong. The moment for collective political action is now. Hashtag tag outro.
This has been an exhaustively detailed analysis of two major geopolitical states, Iran and Pakistan, linked by a shared architecture of control despite their, very different outward appearances.
It's a powerful framework.
We began with the urgent call to action in Tehran, Iran, ruled by the clerical Ayatollah, utterly exhausted after 5 decades of structural misrule.
And we synthesized that detailed roadmap for Iran. External strategic deterrence by Washington, specifically tailored to prevent a massacre and create the necessary space for the organic internal movement.
And this is coupled with the internal mechanism of constitutional continuity. Reza Pahlavi serving as a neutral symbol to swiftly facilitate the election of a constituent assembly within 1 year.
Allowing the people to choose their own permanent system.
Then we transition to Pakistan, ruled by the military Ayatollah, General Munir, where the disease of unaccountable power is arguably deeper, sustained by that unholy alliance of militarism and Islamism.
And the core thread connecting both nations is that fragile facade of democracy covering a concentrated, unelected, unaccountable power structure.
And we analyze the political solutions proposed for Pakistan. Since legitimacy cannot be externally manufactured, the roadmap demands internal mass mobilization.
Using the streets as the last forum of accountability.
Toward democratic renewal. The key transitional bridge is the release and interim prime ministership of Imran Khan, mandated solely to organize that constituent assembly to answer the nation's deepest unresolved questions about civilian supremacy and the permanent limits of military power.
The core foundational work.
So the central reinforcing message for you, our listener, is that understanding this shared architecture of control, whether the unelected authority wears clerical robes or military uniforms, is fundamentally essential to recognizing and supporting genuine demands for popular sovereignty across the region.
It's about seeing past the titles, the managed elections, and the ideological facades to recognize where the real power and, critically, the real economy of control lies.
And that profound realization leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider, building directly on the source material.
We spent a lot of time detailing how both systems rely on monopolistic control over the national economy through military corporations, opaque religious trusts, and patronage systems to sustain elite privilege and manufactured poverty.
So here's the thought. If political transition occurs in either nation, the initial political changes, like holding elections or forming an assembly, are only the start. They're just step one.
What necessary non-electoral steps must the interim governments immediately take to permanently decentralize wealth and shatter the established, decades-old economic architecture of control?
How do you ensure that economic legitimacy follows and reinforces the political transition?
It's not enough to just change the political flag. You must fundamentally break the bank of the old guard and distribute that economic power back to the people. Think about the monumental, maybe unprecedented nature of that economic challenge as these nations stand at the threshold of renewal.